Vivek Narayanan's book of poems include Universal Beach, Life and Times of Mr. S, and the forthcoming, actually, right here, no longer forthcoming, um, After. A full-length collection of his selected poems in Swedish translation was published by the Stockholm-based Wallström and Winstrand in 2015. He has been a fellow at Radcliffe Institute, Harvard University from 2013 to 2014, and a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library. His poems, stories, translations, and critical essays have appeared in journals like Paris Review, Timurenga Chronic, Granta, Poetry Review, Modern Poetry in Translation, Harvard Review, Agni, the Caribbean Review of Books, and elsewhere, as well as in anthologies like the Penguin Book of the Prose Poem and the Blood Axe Book of Contemporary Indian Poetry. Narayanan currently teaches at an MFA program in creative writing at George Mason University and is also a member of the Poetry Daily's editorial board. He was the co-editor of Almost Island, an Indian-based international literary journal from 2007 to 2019. Vivek, thank you so much for joining us. I feel so lucky to be able to interview you, especially after having read this book. And just as we discussed, if you could give us a little bit of context for this book that, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this took you 12 years to write, is that correct? That is an exceptional amount of time, but I think it shows in every page. So if you could tell us a little bit about this, and then we can delve into the work, I think it would be
Thank you very much, Lina, and thanks to CANTO. And thank you also for the title of the panel, Tradition, Tension, and Innovation, Tradition and Experimentation. Because over the course of doing this book, which is a kind of delving into or an experimental translation of an ancient and very influential South Asian epic called the Ramayana, which every Indian knows and doesn't know, and an epic with surprisingly a lot of mysteries hidden in it. And so on one hand, it is the burden of a tradition of too many Ramayanas, because at one point in even in the 14th century, you have poets saying there are so many Ramayanas that it's kind of hurting the shoulders of the elephant that carries the planet, and we need some other poems in the mix. So it's on one hand it's a poem that has seeped into all aspects of South Asian life. Its influence reaches across Asia, and people feel it may have an influence, for instance, in medieval Chinese and Japanese motifs. And in Indonesia, you have the interesting places like Indonesia have an interesting case of where the Ramayana lives on as a folk epic without necessarily the burden of religious interpretation. And so we can come back to that, but the point is, the first thing I thought when I saw the panel is that that the tradition is innovation, that the only way to keep a tradition alive is through innovation and through reevaluating it and rethinking it, ironically. And it's always been that way with the Ramayana, which, and this is the other point, is that it's a multiple tradition. Everybody should read A.K. Ramanujan's famous essay on many Ramayanas. But it's a basic truth that the Ramayana already exists in multiple versions. And I think that's partly because it's drawing from an oral tradition, an oral uh, bardic tradition, which by the time it's being written down already exists in all these different versions, all these different ways of looking at the story and at the poem. And so I think that even if you look at modernism, what Pound is doing, and so on and so forth, the process of innovation always begins with some kind of revisiting or reevaluation of the past. And so it's in examining those multiple traditions around the Ramayana, and those multiple Ramayanas that are already captured inside Valmiki, which is the earliest Sanskrit version, though it might have been in Ramayana, but been in other languages in the oral tradition before it went into Sanskrit. But the Ramayana, the Valmiki is the earliest version we have available to us, and it already contains almost like a kind of kaleidoscopic multiple Ramayanas, multiple ways of looking at the story. So with that said, I'm going to take up one, a couple of flash points. Now the interesting thing about the Ramayana, and I think all ancient epics, is that on one hand they seem to be in praise of the king, but on the other hand they're often also very critical of the king and pessimistic about the king and about the workings of power. And this is true across the world, and I think it's true in the Ramayana as well. So this is a story with the young Rama, who is though his father's not happy about it. There's a warrior priest called Vishwamitra who comes in and wants to take Rama in for military training. And this is when Rama's first learning what it might mean to be a king, and the kinds of violence that he might be implicated in. And so this is the sage, and he's taking Rama out for his first kill, who is a very dangerous woman called Tataka. Sage, tell me, who is she, this disfigured one with the rage and the force of 1,000 elephants? How does a woman come to be so strong that entire armies crossing into her forest are simply torn to strips of skin and lumps of half-chewed flesh? Rama, she's Tataka, once the most beautiful and kind woman in the world, jewel of a daughter to the virtuous and powerful Suketu, wife to the gentle Sunda, mother of the fearless Maricha. It happens that her husband was killed, and she and her son were cursed with these, the hideous, unbearable forms you see. Now she hates Agastya and all of us with every drop of her being. Sage, who killed her husband Sunda? Who disfigured Tataka's body? Rama, you must never hesitate to kill a woman, not for a second. This is the immortal, unwavering rule for a man charged with the burden of kingship. So from this side, we would see that supposedly the elder Vishwamitra is telling Rama that he shouldn't think twice about killing a woman in combat. And you would think that that was where Valmiki's sympathies lie. Um, but in fact, this is a question that is much debated in the ancient texts about whether you can kill a woman in combat, and um, uh, and in the legalistic way in which this question is sometimes solved is that the woman is disfigured instead of being killed. So so this is the first thing, that this is what the option that appears to Rama. Tataka. I'll spare the woman, snip her nose and nipples first. And if that warrior's bluster has not yet left her, I will kill her. Then and only then. Now, Valmiki often has doubles. So on one hand, Tataka is what we now call a Rakshasi, sometimes translated as demon, or is often depicted as demons, right? But right in the Valmiki, you can see that there's another story also there, which is of Tataka as a yakshi, a female spirit. It's actually quite beautiful. So this kind of double tiering is the multiplicity which I'm talking about, which you find all over the place in Valmiki. So this is another take on Tataka, and it owes partly to a depiction of the story at the Matancheri Palace in Kochi. Tataka, the Yakshi, the most beautiful woman in the world, some say, but strong, stronger than elephants, and wise as any mother, and keen. With her son by her side, the shape-shifting Maricha, still a toddler, hand linked in hand, they slipped through the forest they'd made to the clearing of the settlers' camps. Sacrificial fires burned there now that had to be stopped from taking hold. Dawn steals upon them all. So now I'm going to leap, actually, let me see if I can.
Did you just figure it out? I'll finish my thought. It's so wonderful to hear you speak, especially because we met a week ago and you gave me your book and I was so happy and lucky to get it. This is my favorite page, and I hope that it can be captured. And I hope that it doesn't sound disrespectful when I say that it's absolute lunacy to look at it. It is just such phenomenal chaos. I know that like my screen has been made bigger, so that this is, look at that extraordinary chaos. And I think the thing that really attracts me to your work, the thing that attracts me to myths in general, and to the return to what Mircea Eliade calls the myth of eternal return, is the basic element of what a myth is. And mythology and epics are connected, of course. A myth is a story of origin. That's all it is. There are all these other nomenclatures for all these other stories that have magical elements that, you must have this, it must take place in this location, it must have a middle, a beginning, an end, it must end in marriage, it must end in tragedy. But a myth at its core is always just an explanation of the universe. Someone looking at something and saying, this must be understood. This is where it came from. This is not where it came from, or this is the answer to the question that it poses. And to have the answer look like this is one of the truest things I've ever seen. Because the sincere answers to the big questions, the questions that literature takes on, are not the same questions that science takes. They are questions that elude all of the measurements that we have developed. and they look like this. This is the answer to a lot of the big questions that I've been able to like really figure out in my adult life. How do you deal with immigration? How do you leave a country that you love but you're also critical of? How are you critical of a country that you've arrived at and you'll never feel at home at, but you also love? How do you fall in love? Like those, all of those questions, not a single one of them looks like neat lines on, they look like this. And I'm just so appreciative of experimental and experimentalists that take the time and the risk, because we both know that selling a publisher on a page that looks like that is quite difficult. And even conceiving of a way to make the page look in a way that can still be affordable, that can still fit the page, a page that doesn't look like a page but is still a page in essence, is incredibly difficult. And I think it's really noteworthy to say that this book really accomplishes that, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we're still on the question of whether it's acceptable to kill a woman on the battlefield or not, and more generally the question of whether it's acceptable to involve civilians in the battle. So those words, never hesitate to kill a woman, Valmiki uses again about 1,000 pages later. And this time, the woman in question is Sita, who is the heroine of the Ramayana. And she's been abducted by Ravana. And right now, Indrajit, who is Ravana's son, decides he wants to spook the opposing forces. And so he creates a kind of phantom Sita, like a kind of ghostly half doll, half ghost Sita, who he is now going to kill in front of the enemy army. Not Sita, but a phantom. On Indrajit's arm, Sita, but doppelganger zombie, limbs collied and smeared with crud, empty eyes, disheveled, a single braid across her bone-thin face, a single soiled rag to wear, Raghava's darling. Inspecting the spectre, Hanuman's own face, twisted by tears, concluded it was indeed Sita. He'd seen her just recently, that jewel of Janaka, and watching this other joyless one standing in the chariot, her hair in the Rakshasa heir's fingers, our Mahasimian thought called his troops to the sight. Indrajit pulled the Sita clone toward him, unsheathed his sword, and leaning it, slapped that apparition with his free hand on her stand in the chariot, slapped and slapped the figure, even as the Simians watched with shrieks of Ram Ram, watched through tears of pain. Believe me, I'd never hesitate to kill a woman. Not for a second. Not if it could cause pain to the enemy. So said Rama's enemy, that son of Ravana. Right now, watch me. I'll kill her myself. I'll cut her up and then I'll kill Rama, Lakshmana, Sugriva, and I'll kill you, Hanuman. Even in her state, the woman of the lovely thigh, of rapturous shape, glistened in the blue hour, hope's sweet foundry. Indrajit drew the blade diagonally across her, from clavicle to hip, and the pieces fell to the ground. The deed done, he said. Ah, witness my wrath. Rama's woman is slain. Not far away, the simians heard him with open hanging mouths, palms down. For this calamity that had fallen, sure as the evening sun had allowed it. Sita's face, moon white mime with even holes for eyes, split apart and scattered to the winds. Sita, angel of death, in your dusk blue cloth, and the body before the moment's knife, already lifeless, heavy. Sita, field of marigolds, chalk face, clown head, holy shroud. The sunken spots were the ones that watched you. So, and then I'm going to do, I'll do one more, uh, just going with this idea of the multiplicity of the text, which is so crucial to the Ramayana. Um, I have, I'm constantly, there are a number of poems with the same name where I constantly kind of retaking the text, that the passage in different ways. And this one now comes from the book. There are four books to after. Um, there is City and Forest, which is the first book, and that's the first three books of Valmiki. Then there is Dreams and Nightmares, which is the second book. And then there's War. And then there's After, or Uttara, the later history of Rama and of the Ramayana. And so in there's a sequence I have on Abdul Rahim's Ramayana. So Abdul Rahim was a very fascinating character, head of the Mughal armies, translator of the Pamarnama from Turkey, which is his Turkic, which is his mother tongue, to Persian, poet in Sanskrit, a bookmaker, and he commissions one of three Akbari Ramayanas, and there are it's an incredible translation project that really gets going in this era, where they're translating huge amounts of different Indian texts into Persian. And the Ramayana was very beloved, and this was one that Abdul Rahim probably did translate it himself, because he was an accomplished poet in both Persian and Sanskrit, and who commissioned with sort of Hindu and Muslim painters. And so I have a whole sequence which is just reading the images in this text, because I can't read the Persian. But the images often show how closely the painters have been reading the text. And so anyway, so the head painter on this particular image is Kazim, and the poem is Not Sita but a Phantom. The same scene that you saw before. Not only the nausea of the scene, not just the harshest, most meaningless crime. Nowhere the armies arrayed the mirages of distance, not from the height of the chariot and the sword, not the ritually certified diagonally cut. Not Hanuman, so close here as to be implicated. And Sita, no, not her, but the representation of her. Not the representation of her, but her limbs twisted like the children of Kushanabu. Not the text, filled with choicest curses. Not Indrajit, Ravana's talented son and practicing magician, looking here like a hardcore thug, despite the loveliness of his shinlets. Not the artist who lives in the exploitation of violence and pain. Not the apprentice who hankers after style. Not the critic whose chin feels slightly displaced. Never the reader, the distracted assassin. Not Valmiki whose debts are absolved. Not we whose role is in the quelling of the air. Not the dose by which it is kept unspoken or unrevealed. Not the people of whom it is said would rather have it fed to them. Not the soul whose price is dignity. Not the individual signature that confirms the collective guilt. Not the numerous unpainted pages of the manuscript, all the way from early in Valmiki's fourth to well into the war. Not the trace of missing images in the hearts where they may have been hidden. Not the history for which the living pages were made, nor the one into which they were written. Not the zone for which life itself was a kind of memory.
That was extraordinary. When we spoke, you mentioned how important it was for you that readings should also be performed. And I'm so glad that I got to see how you perform them rather than, a very common poet monotone that I know we both know.
Yeah. That's something that's very always been very important to me, and for me, it also kind of links back to the oral tradition around the Ramayana, and so yeah, so I'm glad for the opportunity to have a little bit of time to perform as well.
Would you like to read the last poem that you discussed that you wanted to read? And I will participate in reading. And then if we have time, we can talk a little bit about what I really love is what you were saying, like in order to sort of preserve, you have to experiment. And I keep thinking this is I understand that this is irreverent, and I hope that it's fine because it's not my culture to be irreverent with. But the entire time I read this book, I was thinking the Ramayana would be such a great video game. Like truly, it's kind of built in like the epic video game scale. And the way that you preserve something for future generations is not by putting it into a glass box, but hurling it full force into the future and see what little bits and parts like can like really have sticking power. But
Yeah.
we will have. Go
Well, if I
ahead. Go
can,
ahead.
I mean, actually, I could respond to that, and then we
Mhm.
could talk. I have maybe just I'll do a closing poem, which will, maybe a closing couple of poems, which will take me about, I think, about 6 minutes. So, but I
Okay.
just, I wanted to take up what you were saying because I think it's important. I think that some of the Ramayana characters are already in video games. Um,
Yes,
yeah,
for
my
sure.
students have run into them, and you're right, that's entirely appropriate. And and the Ramayana has always kind of spread radically like that into different forms, painting, as we've seen, dance, and all of those things. Um, but there's another thing which you've said, right, which is that how reverent or how irreverent should we be? And for me, I had to find a place in which to critique the Ramayana, because there are a lot of problematic aspects, especially the Valmiki, for instance. It's very obviously patriarchal text in many places, right? And and so there is when engaging with these texts of the past, there's always that question of whether we're going to valorize them or we're going to do a critical reading. And for me, I found that the critical reading actually opens up a huge amount, and it was by way of doing a critical reading that I began to really discover the riches of the Ramayana, and almost a way in which the text was also responding to my critical reading, and so on. And so in fact, the way to really keep our traditions alive is not by kind of enshrining them in amber or freezing them, but be able to tap in with them and engage them, and curiously, a critical reading of the Ramayana for me was what really opened me up to its riches, you know, um, and also the possibility of yeah, multiplicity. Did you have any other questions or thoughts, sir?
I mean, it's a lengthy book, so I have way more questions than I think several hours could contain. But I will say that the thing that you're mentioning makes perfect sense, because the way that we think about criticism of any of the critical theories begin with exegesis. They begin with the hermeneutic breakdown of the most common text, the text that everybody knew, which is the Bible, right? Sort of like that breaking down. And I I'm fairly irreverent with the culture that was given to me, because it is mine. It is mine to be irreverent with, um, and because it is the universe that I was given, and it is my job to take it apart, to understand it, and then to remake it in as many images as I possibly can. So the Bible, for example, is the thing that was given to me, and I don't want irreverence to be sort of trod down or made to seem as something really mundane, when what irreverence really is and what it can do is it perhaps mundane was a wrong word. It brings it to us. That's what it is, right? And we are commanded to understand these texts as best as we can. And the thing that we understand the most is our own body and our own flesh and our own dirty experience. So to bring those texts into that experience, that corporeal element, is to follow commandment, quote unquote. So exegesis, hermeneutics with the Bible, there's nothing more natural than to bring it down. Ye are commanded to read it and to be perfect, and be perfect within the text is to be taken apart. So it makes perfect sense to me. I simply do not understand and know this text as well as you do. So I'm very careful to sort of like tread lightly on it. But I hope that all of the holy texts, for all of those who inherit them, are given a certain amount of, not a certain amount, as close a reading as you present, because only then can they become more than what they are. In glass boxes, their creative potential is hindered in.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, now I can speak for the Ramayana, right? And that, Romila Thapar, for instance, has shown that dissent has a very long history in India. That there's a long traditions of kind of argument and dissent, and multiple ways of approaching it, and so um, the Ramayana has been that way. And for me, um, I really want to see it as a world text. I don't want to see it as a text that belongs to any particular religion or region or so on, and because it has that kind of potential for me, and as I think any epic should, any of the epics from around the world that we
Yes.
ignore. That's the other thing we haven't talked about, is that there are uh, uh, African epics, there are indigenous American epics. There's a huge world of thought there that goes beyond the Greco-Roman tradition. But the Ramayana from the start, for instance, it has always also been a Buddhist text and a Jain text, and some of those are very early versions. And we've seen that long tradition of Muslim Ramayanas, um, and then we've seen it, move across places. Um, and in my class, I actually encourage students to do their own Ramayanas at the end of the class. Um,
Wow.
and they come up with fantastic insights into it by um, bringing the Ramayana into their own lives and their own thought processes and things like that, and contexts. And I think that there is a difference between someone who has a superficial understanding of the text and someone who has an emotional understanding with the text, and then also someone who has, somebody who's spent some time delving. Those do produce different kinds of reactions. But my fear is, I don't want to create any kind of. I'm wary of prohibitions, I guess, and I think
Of
that the
course.
Ramayana really has a potential to be kind of taken up across um, cultures, and it already has. It already holds that history. Um, so that's rather appropriate, actually, for the poem I was going to read now. So the I mean, in the last part of the book, we have scenes from contemporary India. And sometimes it's not specifically so much the Ramayana itself, but maybe the Ramayana's concerns with ethics, with straight statecraft, and Sanskrit, the life of Sanskrit in contemporary India. And so this one actually contains a translation in it. It's a kind of slightly loose translation done for my mother, Padma Narayanan, and it's of a Sanskrit song hymn called Maitrim Bhajata, which was written in the 1960s by a kind of interesting, innovative religious leader. It was written and sung at the United Nations by a very famous singer called M.S. Subbulakshmi. I'm not going to sing it for you, but this was the translation is also given to the protest at Shaheen Bagh against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and the extraordinary protests of Muslim women at Shaheen Bagh. And so it begins with a quote, again a quote, and then again another free translation of um, a section of a very famous poem by Faiz Ahmed Faiz. So this is called To Shaheen Bagh in Absentia. बस नाम रहेगा अल्लाह के, जो गायब भी हजीर भी, जो मंजर भी nazir भी. Yes, the name alone will stay, the unseen still here, and the thing seen being also the observer. Faiz. I wasn't there at Shaheen Bagh those winter days when thousands gathered, when it seemed all of Delhi, in the brilliance of its inventiveness, in the earnestness of its grit, was there. Is it true the roads almost belonged to us, that we took in faces with such renewed curiosity, and song stuttered forth in the unbeliever's hands? I've known what it means to rub shoulders in a place like that, when the glance of touch and the touching glance slipped like its own innocent being through the evening's rush. This melancholy distance of the seen and the there-ness of the unseen. The way something will sprout at the most innocuous traffic light, an idea or body or refurbishable item. And soon the corner will come to that and only that. And the goods and minutiae of traffic and crowds will learn to flow around it in both impatience and attentive embrace. I wasn't there at Shine Bagh in those first days of its glory to see it hold this way, clasped to memory and habit. But whatever happens, the name will stay, swim to the skies above us, given as token to the witness of paradise and the real blood it asked of us. Maitrim Bhajata, a translation for Padma Narayanan. Grow friendship at the heart. See other souls as you see your own. Give up war. Give up competition. Give up the acquisition or occupation by force. Invent, thrash out, and make real the three Das: Damyata, Datta, Dayadvam, restraint, charity, mercy, and prosperity for all the peoples.
That's, I'm sure that there will be clapping, but I'm so, this has been a complete delight. I know that there was some complication, but you're you have an incredible generosity and wealth of intellect and a depth of thought. And I'm so happy to have been able to interview you. I'm so happy to have been able to read your book. It was the most pleasant 15-hour read that I've ever had in a plane. And thank you so much for your time. I hope that you have a great day. Is it day where you are right now?
It is,
It is
yes.
night here. And it's coming. We're on day 3 of CANTO. Tomorrow is the last day, and I can't imagine a better way to be ending my day tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and hello to all. Yeah, bye. Yes.